Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Season 3 of The Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I'm Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Ray.
Last time, Graham, you suggested we might look at the role of Money Laundering Reporting Officer, or MLRO, and look at some of the highs and lows one can experience in that position.
Yes, I thought that might be of some interest to our listeners.
You could be right. I suppose a good place to start is why the role exists and what the regulators expect of this person.
Well, Ray, that sounds like a good idea. So, given that you have up till very, very recently been one of these, where would you like to start?
In the early hours of the 13th of March 1964, I think.
Well, assuming that's not the date you started in your role, you're going to need to give me some context.
Okay, well, I always think it's useful to look at the death of Kitty Genovese in New York. I think we can trace the role of the MLRO back to that event in many ways.
Okay. I know the case, Ray. It's pretty famous, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Graham. Do you want to recap the main facts for us? I say main facts. I mean, more recently, the New York Times and others have gone back and found fault with some of the original reporting. But I think we can work with the core facts as they initially emerged.
I think you're right. So let's just cover off what we know. Kitty Genovese, or Genovese, if you want the New York pronunciation, was 28 years old when late one evening she was arriving back at her home. She was attacked with a knife by a man called Winston Mosley, but she put up a pretty decent and considerable fight.
And a noisy one, Graham.
Yes, as reported, so much so that Mosley fled and left Kitty in an alleyway by her home uh, without finishing the job because he thought her cries would bring help and lead to his apprehension.
But that didn't happen, did it?
Well, no, it didn't. He returned a while later and found a rather weakened Kitty still on her own and quickly finished the job, as it were, before making his escape. It was later estimated, although subsequently challenged, that as many as 38 witnesses saw or heard the attack, and allegedly none of them called the police or came to her aid.
Yes, and this is what the New York Times, reporting on the case at the time, christened the bystander effect. That the more individuals who witness a given effect and know that others are witnessing it, the less likely they are to do anything personally.
Yeah, they're happy to assume that one of the other people will do something, and perhaps they might decide that even their involvement would make matters worse.
Incidentally, Mosley would probably have got away scot-free, except that he was arrested during a house burglary 6 days later and confessed while in custody to Kitty's murder.
Oh, and what happened to him?
He was banged up for life, Graham, after his initial death sentence was commuted. He died in prison in 2016 at the age of 81.
And for the sake of our non-UK listeners, banged up for life means
Means imprisoned.
imprisoned.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Okay, let's leave it there, shall we?
But it's a great expression, and thank you for that. So, Ray, assuming that you're not expecting to be banged up for life,
Uh,
what is the connection to the MLRO?
well, quite simply, Graham, the position of an MLRO, or the requirement for an MLRO, I think seeks to eliminate the bystander effect when it comes to firms reporting financial crime to the authorities. I mean, we always say that preventing and detecting financial crime is everyone's job, which is true. But in saying that, we risk introducing the bystander effect. Now, the MLRO responsibility means that, at least when it comes to reporting, there is a single person in the firm who's unambiguously responsible for all such reporting.
Okay, so that hopefully there can't be a bystander effect where several people all think that someone else will report possible money laundering activity to law enforcement.
That's the idea.
And actually, that same principle, thinking about it, is behind the UK senior management regime, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that one arises from public dissatisfaction that 10 years ago, after the financial crisis, it was found impossible in most cases to bring any individuals to account for the actions of financial services firms that led to or exacerbated the problems at the time.
Mm.
So, under the senior management regime, the SMR, there's a set of what they call prescribed responsibilities, each of which must be allocated to a named individual executive and a single individual executive of every firm.
And within that, several of those responsibilities are usually assigned, if I'm right, to the MLRO, aren't they?
Yes, they are. The MLRO position is designated SMF 17 in the senior management regime. It's often combined with the SMF 16 head of compliance role, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. Now, I'm generalizing a little here, but typically, all responsibilities that relate to preventing, detecting, and reporting financial crime in the firm will be assigned to the MLRO, although some might sit with the CEO of the firm. And the CEO will also have the overall accountability for how the senior management responsibilities are assigned and performed.
Great. I think that's pretty clear. And although this is a UK specific regulatory framework, most countries will have a similar requirement, I think, at least for money laundering reporting, if not for the whole of the senior management regime.
Yes. Now, it's worth noting that the European Union's fourth anti money laundering directive, which is what determines all European states' rules right now, places a number of wider responsibilities on senior management in a firm. So that's a constant right across Europe and is required of non European Union firms with a presence in Europe. So the upshot of that is that you'll have to look quite hard to find a bank with anything other than a very local scope that doesn't have an MLRO role.
I think that is a very fair conclusion. And it's also, I think, worth making clear that in the UK, these reporting responsibilities are technically assigned to someone called a nominated officer, which comes from specific AML and terrorism acts that predate the 2017 money laundering regulations that set the requirements for the MLRO. But having said that, usually the MLRO is also the nominated officer.
Mm.
So I think from here on in, let's just talk about the MLRO and assume it includes the nominated officer role as well.
Yes, for the sake of simplicity, Graham, and also because that reflects reality in most banks too.
Agreed. So the job then, it's called a reporting officer. So reporting is obviously important.
Hmm.
What do you report then, Ray, and to whom?
Well, from the rest of the title of the role, you'd imagine this was only about reporting instances of money laundering, but that's not the case. Clearly, actual money laundering that's identified needs to be included and reported, but the bar for reporting comes much lower than that.
Well, yes, because it's about suspicion, isn't it?
That's right. As an MLRO, I don't have to provide proof that there's any money laundering occurring. I just have to reasonably suspect it.
And it's not just money laundering, is it?
No, for instance, I might see indications of corruption in a deal that a bank is looking at for a client. Now, ultimately, corruption is a predicate crime that would need to lead to money laundering if the criminal wants to get use of their money back.
Hmm.
But if we can catch it at this earlier stage, that's clearly going to be better.
Well, it is. But to complicate matters, you also have to report suspected terrorism finance.
Yes, yes, I do. And do you want to explain what makes that more complicated?
Of course. So money laundering always arises from some illicit activity, and then you have at least two opportunities to catch it, which is at the original illicit activity, and then subsequently when the criminal seeks to launder the proceeds of his or her crime. And Ray, I say at least two opportunities, but because money laundering is actually normally a series of operations rather than a single transaction, it might well be more than that.
That's a fair point, and that's a good summary.
Thank you. And of course, the primary thing is that money laundering is a circular flow because if you're going to launder money, eventually you want that money to come back into your own hand so you can enjoy the fruits of your crime. But of course, that's not how terrorism funding works, firstly, because it's not necessarily illicit funds that are in play here.
No, people can be funding terrorism through legitimately earned money.
Absolutely. And also, this isn't a circular flow. Money passes from the funding person to the terrorist. Now, there may be complexity, but that's to disguise the flow itself. And it isn't circular, it's linear. And very often, of course, there isn't a predicate crime to be found behind it.
Mm. Yep, so that's what we're reporting: suspected money laundering, suspected commission of predicate crime, or suspected terrorism finance. And of course, suspected financial crime more widely, which also includes sanctions evasion.
Well, yeah, specifically domestic sanctions and any international sanctions that apply within your jurisdiction or to that in which the activity undertaken by your firm takes place.
Yes, that's right. Currency is a factor too, Graham. Any US dollar transaction, wherever it happens, is subject to US OFAC sanctions, for instance.
And that is only part of the story, though, isn't it, Ray?
Indeed, every country maintains its own list, and there will always be some supranational ones that need to be observed locally. And depending on what locally means in your particular situation, it can be ever so tricky.
Yeah, I know we commonly see situations where a country might face blanket sanctions under OFAC, but the EU prohibits trade only in certain goods or involving certain persons associated with that country.
Yes, and we've seen this recently with Iran. Strictly speaking, a London bank can observe just the EU restrictions, but the US tends to be quite bullish if its stance isn't followed, and there are enough European banks reliant on US licenses to muddy those waters.
Of course. So, money laundering, predicate crimes, terrorist financing, sanctions evasion, that's what you're reporting.
Mm,
And we should say that there is a duty to report as soon as you reasonably can anything that is reportable, whether this activity is in the past or in the present,
mm,
or whether it hasn't actually happened yet, but you suspect it will. So,
yep.
so to whom are you actually reporting it?
Uh, to law enforcement authorities, Graham. Every jurisdiction will have a designated report receiving agency. In the UK, it's the NCA, the National Crime Agency.
Okay, so is all this reporting traffic just that one way?
Oh, by no means, Graham. The NCA is an intelligence agency, so it investigates to deepen its intelligence. That might prompt further questions back to the MLRO to ask more about a report, or the trail may take them to firms other than the one that initiated the report. I've had the NCA contact me, for instance, to ask about clients whose names have arisen in investigations that began elsewhere in other firms.
Okay, but that's tricky, Ray, isn't it? Because you've got
Hmm.
client confidentiality to think about.
You have. Ultimately, the NCA recognises that and won't want to put you in a difficult position. They're able to produce production orders, which basically have the effect of court instructions to produce information or documents, and that makes it easy for you to comply.
And is it worth saying that reporting doesn't necessarily mean you have to stop the transaction or the activity that you are reporting?
Yes, Graham. There are times when it's the worst thing you can do. Because you're alerting the criminals potentially that you're onto them when that's the last thing that law enforcement would want. And in cases like that, you may be instructed to proceed with a transaction. And in the UK, there's a special type of report called a Defence Against Money Laundering, or DAML, where you can ask the NCA's permission to proceed with a transaction or a relationship or an activity where suspicions exist and where you fear if you were to allow it, your bank might be breaking the law.
And that used to be referred to in my time, going back, as a consent request, didn't it?
Hmm.
And do they always give that consent?
Not always, Graham, but often they will, depending on the particular circumstances.
Okay, so that's the external reporting side. But Ray, that's not all of it, because you also receive
Mm.
reports internally, don't you?
Yeah, the MLRO is the only person in the firm usually allowed to report to the NCA, but he or she can't know everything the bank is doing for every client 24/7.
So there has to be some internal reporting regime in place so that staff in the firm look for suspicious activity and report it to the MLRO for further consideration.
Yes, and the MLRO is responsible for setting up and overseeing that system.
Okay, and once the system is in place, what does that entail?
Well, mostly it's about making sure everyone understands and acts on their responsibility to report. Um, it's about investigating the reports that come in, establishing whether there's a need to report externally, and then acting accordingly.
But I guess you'd also want to look at whether you're getting the right things reported to you in the right
Hmm.
way. I mean, you wouldn't want to be, for example, bombarded with needless reports or receiving reports without enough information to investigate them.
No, and if you're not careful, you can get overwhelmed with those reports. You know, the ones where there isn't enough information, so that every
Hmm.
time you have to go back and scrabble around for details before you can even begin to do the job of investigating.
So I guess part of the work, your work as an MLRO then, was educating the staff.
Yes, but not just educating them in reporting.
Go on.
Well, as an MLRO, you've got a vested interest in all of your staff properly understanding and being able to identify financial crime. So you'll want to be involved at least in setting policies and procedures, in training, and in the various systems and controls that relate to the detection and prevention of financial crime.
Whoa, it's a big job, Ray.
It is.
So, so putting that to one side, what are some of the activities that occupy your time?
Well, there's all that we've spoken about so far. Um, as an MLRO in all but the tiniest organisations, you'd have a team that supported you in the investigation work, and they might prepare your reports to the NCA, but you'd have to sign off on all of them.
Well, yes, of course.
And then there's the other reporting. A UK MLRO has to make a regular report to the regulators that covers all aspects of the firm's anti financial crime activity. And annually, you've got to prepare and present a report to the board of the firm on the operation and adequacy of the firm's systems and controls for financial crime.
And we've spoken about policy and procedure work and involvement in training,
Yeah.
but but do you have day-to-day involvement then in the bank's dealings with clients as well?
At a remove, yes.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, for example, the MLRO will usually have a role in considering new higher risk clients and whether the bank should take them on. Often this will be through some sort of regular client acceptance committee where the MLRO will have a seat.
Okay, so you have a direct say in whether the client is taken on or not.
Yes.
And that's not just new clients, is it? That would also
Hmm.
have to include existing clients that might come up for regular review or where something happens that changes the financial crime risk of the client to the bank.
Yes, that's true. Another example of my involvement at a remove is the approval of new products and promotions.
Okay, so this is when the bank wants to launch a new product or service or to promote an existing one in a new or a different way.
Yes, lots of people would be involved in that process, including legal, operational risk, finance, and so on. But the MLRO will have to assess and sign off on the financial crime aspects. If the MLRO is also the head of compliance, as they often are, then he or she will also look at the financial promotions rules of the regulator and so on.
Okay, is there anything else that occupies the MLRO's time?
Well, Graham, there is the usual senior management workload of committees, team management, and so on.
Of course.
And there's the regular contact with the regulators.
Okay, so in what sort of context would that happen?
All regulators will have a regular programme of firm visits and inspections. In the UK, smaller firms might avoid visits per se, but there will be remote scrutiny and conversations. And the MLRO is on point for the firm in all of those interactions.
Okay, so the MLRO is effectively the regulator's gateway into the firm then.
Yes, we speak the same language, if you like.
Hmm.
Um, and I suppose, finally, as an MLRO, you're an internal contact point to all parts of the firm too, in an advisory capacity. And that can sometimes be very time consuming.
Uh, yeah, I'm sure it can be, but if things go well, it's a rewarding job, isn't it?
Yes, Graham, in all senses of the word. It's very satisfying to have such a pivotal role in keeping your firm and indeed society safer from criminals and terrorists. And it's a pretty senior role that's usually very well paid.
Okay, but I think it has to be, Ray, given the personal responsibility and the cost of getting it wrong.
Mm. And you've got an example of that, haven't you, Graham?
I have, Ray. It's the Sonali Bank example. Shall I explain what happened there?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay, I think we should begin with the summary in the FCA's final notice against Stephen George Smith, who's the former MLRO of Sonali Bank UK, and that was issued in October 2016. That, I must say, starts with a great description of the MLRO role.
Oh, what does it say?
Well, I'll quote directly from the final notice. It says, quote, "The role of MLRO is a vital one in any regulated firm. The implementation of adequate AML systems and controls requires an MLRO who takes a robust approach, ensures that AML responsibilities are understood at all levels of the organisation, has sound knowledge of the controls, ensures that regular testing and monitoring is carried out, and escalates concerns appropriately to senior management." End quote.
That is a good summary. And there's a great point there that we haven't really touched on. I mean, as well as the MLRO's annual report to the board, the MLRO is expected to undertake routine testing so they can keep senior management very well informed about financial crime across the firm.
Absolutely.
Um, and against this description of the role, Mr. Smith was found wanting.
He was, Ray. In 2010, Sonali had been required by the regulator to put in place plans to address what the regulator described as, quote, serious failings, unquote,
Oof,
in its AML systems and controls. Now, there was a remediation plan in place when Mr. Smith joined the bank in 2011. The final notice says that he failed in subsequent years to put in place compliance monitoring plans that were focused on Sonali's risks, and that demonstrated their systems were working effectively.
ouch.
Yes, and this despite warnings given to him from the bank's internal auditors.
Ooh, double ouch.
Yeah, but the FCA notes that Mr. Smith was suffering from being overworked personally and from a lack of resource in the department.
Oh, so not his fault then.
Well, that's not the view the regulator took, Ray. They said he failed to impress on senior management the need for further resource, and when he was given permission to recruit more resource, he didn't do it quickly enough.
Wow. Harsh, you could say?
Well, I know you're playing devil's advocate here, Ray. You don't really think that judgment was harsh, do you?
Not given what followed in the summary, no, Graham. The FCA says that he continued to reassure the board and senior management that the AML systems were working effectively, that he didn't take sufficient steps to address the concerns of the internal auditors, he didn't adequately report internal testing results, nor did he put in place effective systems to ensure staff would be aware of their AML responsibilities, nor investigate failures to conduct due diligence and ongoing monitoring of clients and transactions.
Indeed. And in 2014, there were found to be systemic AML failings throughout the bank's business.
Mm-hmm. Yep. What happened to Mr. Smith?
Well, the FCA issued him with a personal fine as well as fining the bank.
Oh, how much?
Over £3 million,
Ooh.
Ray. That is the bank, of course, not
Ah.
Mr. Smith. But he personally was fined just under £18,000.
Ooh.
Um, The notice noted that these would have been higher but for his and the bank's early agreement to settle. And
Hmm.
more importantly, they immediately banned Mr. Smith from performing the MLRO or head of compliance or equivalent role in relation to any regulated activities carried out by FCA authorised or exempt firms in the future.
Oh, wow. Okay. Um, so, given the guy was actually working hard, and the report acknowledges he was making some improvements in the bank, clearly he was hampered by a lack of resource and wasn't getting support from senior management. What should he have done? What should any MLRO do faced with that challenge?
Well, helpfully, the FCA makes that clear in their report, and let me quote from it
Oh.
again. So, it quotes, there are a number of steps available to an MLRO who does not enjoy such support and who has concerns about the AML systems in place at a firm. These include ensuring that concerns are appropriately reported to senior management, escalating concerns to the board or to relevant risk or audit committees, highlighting concerns to internal or external auditors, requesting independent expert advice on the areas of concern, outlining concerns fully and appropriately in the annual MLRO reports, or reporting concerns to the authority. Any such report to the authority could be made on a confidential basis. End quote.
Mm.
And then it goes on to say that Mr. Smith failed to take any of those steps.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Now, we've only quoted from the summary of this notice, and the full thing, it's about 50 pages, is recommended reading for anyone acting as or considering acting as an MLRO.
I agree. So, as a reminder, the final notice is available from the FCA website, and you can search for Sonali Bank. So, Sonali is Sonali.
Okay. Now, Graham, as we've signposted previously, we've got a bit of live activity coming up, and I'm sure we'll meet some listeners when we run those events. But what's next for the podcast itself?
Well, Ray, given some very recent developments in the Danske Bank story, I think it might be time to take a very deep breath before diving into the world of correspondent banking.
Oh, gulp. I'm
Uh,
looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Dark Money Files. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to listen to future episodes, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or your normal podcast provider. Thanks.